You saw the photos before you ever bought the plant. A whole fence disappearing under purple. A trellis so loaded with blooms you can't even see the wood underneath. An arch that looks like something out of a fairy tale. So you went out, you bought yourself a clematis, you found a nice sunny spot, you dug a hole, you popped it in, and you waited. And waited. A few leaves showed up. Maybe. If you were lucky, one single flower appeared, looking almost embarrassed to be there. And then, just when you thought things might be turning a corner, the whole plant collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually. Overnight, like somebody walked by and unplugged it. Here's the truth. Nobody tells you when you're standing at the garden center holding that little pot. Clematis is not actually a difficult plant to grow. It's a misunderstood one, and there's a very specific reason for that. Almost everything your gardening instincts tell you to do with a clematis is exactly the wrong move, because this plant simply doesn't follow the same rulebook as everything else in your yard. It's planted differently, it climbs differently, it drinks differently, and it even gets pruned differently depending on which type you've got. Today we're going through 5 planting mistakes that quietly sabotage clematis before it ever gets the chance to put on the show you paid for. And I want to be clear about something up front. Every single one of these mistakes is fixable, even if your plant has already been sitting in the ground for years. Nobody is telling you to dig it up and start over. These are small corrections, the kind you can make on a Saturday afternoon with tools you already own. And honestly, that's the part that frustrates me most about how clematis gets talked about online. People treat it like a fragile diva of a plant, something only expert gardeners with decades of experience can handle. That reputation isn't fair, and it isn't accurate. Clematis has been climbing walls and fences in cottage gardens for centuries, without anyone needing a horticulture degree. The plant isn't the problem. Bad information is the problem. So stick with me, because the mistakes stack on top of each other, and the last one is the one that trips up almost every single person who's ever grown this plant. Even people who've been gardening for decades and should really know better by now. Let's get into it. Mistake number 1. Ignoring what sun and shade actually means. You've probably heard the classic line about clematis. People repeat it like a proverb. Clematis likes its head in the sun and its feet in the shade. It sounds nice. It sounds like something your grandmother would have cross-stitched onto a pillow. The problem is, almost nobody actually explains what that sentence means in practice, so people hear it, nod, and then go plant their clematis in a way that only satisfies half the equation. Here's what's really going on. The top half of the plant, meaning the leaves, the stems, and eventually the flowers, genuinely craves sunlight. We're talking about a solid 6 hours a day as the target. Most people get this part right without even trying, because it's intuitive. You want flowers, flowers need sun, so you plant it somewhere bright, and you walk away feeling like you've done your job. But the roots are an entirely different story, and this is the part everyone forgets. Clematis roots despise heat. They despise drying out. If the base of your plant is sitting there in bare, exposed soil, with the afternoon sun hammering directly down onto it, that soil heats up fast, the moisture evaporates out of it even faster, and the roots underneath start to panic. A stressed root system does not send up cheerful, healthy growth. It shuts down. It goes into survival mode. And a clematis in survival mode does not flower. It just sits there, technically alive, looking sad and unimpressive, while you wonder what you did wrong. The good news is that this fix takes about 30 seconds and costs almost nothing. You've got a few different ways to solve it, and you don't need to do all of them. Just pick whichever suits your yard. You can lay a flat paving stone or a couple of slabs over the root zone. That stone does double duty, shading the soil underneath and helping it hold onto moisture instead of baking dry. Alternatively, you can plant something low and leafy right in front of the base of the clematis. A hardy geranium works beautifully here, or any other low, bushy perennial that can throw a bit of shade over that root area without competing too hard for space. Or, simplest of all, you just pile on a generous layer of mulch. Bark chips, compost, shredded leaves, whatever you've got lying around the yard works fine. Just make sure you pull the mulch back an inch or two from the actual stem itself, because mulch sitting directly against the stem holds moisture right where you don't want it and can invite rot. The lesson here is simple. Bare, sun-baked dirt at the base of a clematis is a slow, quiet killer. A stone, a ground cover plant, or a handful of mulch solves the entire problem almost instantly, and yet it's one of the most commonly skipped steps in the whole process. And here's a small detail worth mentioning, because people always ask about it. This shading trick isn't just for the height of summer. Even in spring, on those unexpectedly warm afternoons before you've thought to mulch, bare soil can heat up faster than you'd expect, especially if it's a darker soil that absorbs heat rather than reflecting it. So don't wait until July to sort this out. Get the shading in place early in the season, before the roots ever have a chance to get stressed in the first place. Prevention is always easier than trying to nurse a sulking plant back to health after the damage is already done. Mistake number 2, giving it something it physically cannot climb. Take a walk through almost any neighborhood and you'll spot at least one struggling clematis flopped over at the base of a fence post, a pergola leg, or a mailbox, looking like a green puddle instead of a climbing vine. The gardener who planted it is usually baffled. They gave it a big sturdy structure to climb. Why won't it climb? The answer comes down to understanding exactly how clematis climbs, because it's not like other vines. Clematis doesn't have little sticky suction pads the way ivy does. It doesn't wrap its entire stem around a support the way a runner bean or morning glory does. Instead, clematis climbs using its leaf stalks. Those thin little stems that connect each leaf to the main vine reach out into open air, and if they touch something, they curl around it like a tiny curling finger, gripping tight. That's the whole mechanism. And here's the catch that trips up so many people. Those leaf stalks can only curl around something thin. We're talking pencil diameter or smaller, a strand of wire, a length of garden twine, a slim bamboo cane, a thin wooden batten. Anything in that general size range gets grabbed almost instantly. But hand that same plant something thick, a solid fence post, a brick wall, a chunky pergola beam, the trunk of a tree, and the leaf stalks reach out, find nothing they can physically wrap around, and give up. The plant isn't lazy, and it isn't broken. You've simply handed it a structure it has no biological way of gripping. So if your dream is clematis climbing up a brick wall, don't just plant it at the base and hope for the best. Install a grid of wires, or attach a section of thin trellis to that wall first, and let the plant climb that instead. If you're aiming for a thick post or a pergola leg, wrap that post in plastic or wire netting, or coil some garden wire around it, giving the leaf stalks something narrow enough to actually grab onto. Get this piece right, and clematis turns into one of the easiest, most obliging climbers you'll ever grow. Get it wrong, and even the most vigorous, healthiest vine on the market will just sit there in a tangled heap at ground level, no matter how much you baby it. One more thing worth pointing out here. If you've already got a clematis flopping around at the base of something thick, you don't necessarily need to move the plant. You just need to retrofit the support. Wrap that netting or wire around the post now, gently guide the existing stems toward it, and give the tendrils something to find. Within a couple of weeks, you'll usually see the plant start gripping on its own, catching up fast once it finally has something to hold. Mistake number 3, planting too close to the wall or fence. This mistake is sneaky because the spot looks absolutely perfect when you're standing there with your shovel. You've got a lovely brick wall or a solid wooden fence. You picture the clematis eventually smothering it in flowers, so naturally you dig your planting hole right up against the base of that structure and tuck the plant in nice and tight. And then it struggles, and you genuinely can't figure out why, because on paper you did everything right. Sunny spot, decent support nearby, good intentions all around. The culprit here is something most people have never even heard of, the rain shadow. The narrow strip of ground running directly along the base of a wall or a solid fence is actually one of the driest patches of soil in your entire garden. The structure itself blocks rain from ever reaching that ground, and to make matters worse, brick and stone foundations are notoriously thirsty, pulling whatever moisture does exist right out of the surrounding soil. So without realizing it, you've taken a plant that desperately wants consistently moist roots, and you've planted it in the single driest spot available, no matter how much rain falls elsewhere in the yard. The fix here completely changes the outcome, and it's really just about adjusting where you dig. Move your planting hole out at least 12 to 18 inches from the base of the wall or fence, out into the zone where rainfall actually lands and soaks into the ground normally. Then, instead of planting the clematis straight upright, angle the entire root ball so the plant leans toward the support structure. Lay the stem at a gentle diagonal slant and let it travel back toward the wall to begin its climb from there. This way, the roots stay out in living moist soil where they're actually happy, while the top growth still gets to climb exactly where you originally pictured it. Same wall, same eventual view covered in blooms, completely different outcome, just because the roots aren't sitting in a desert anymore. It's also worth mentioning that this rain shadow problem gets worse the older and taller the wall or fence is, since more established structures tend to have deeper, thirstier foundations, and often overhanging eaves that block even more rainfall than you'd expect just by looking at them. If you've got a clematis that's already struggling right up against an older brick wall, moving it out those extra 12 to 18 inches can genuinely be the difference between a plant that survives and one that thrives. Mistake number 4. Planting at the same depth as the pot. This is the big one. This is the mistake that feels the most correct, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous, and it trips up even experienced gardeners who've grown dozens of other plants successfully. Every gardening instinct you've ever developed tells you the same thing. When you take a plant out of its nursery pot, you plant it at the same soil level it was already sitting at. Match the soil line exactly. Don't bury the stem any deeper than it already was. This rule keeps your roses thriving. It keeps your tomatoes thriving. It keeps almost every single plant in your garden thriving. Clematis is the glaring exception to this rule, and ignoring that exception is probably the single biggest reason so many clematis plants fail within their first year or two. With clematis, you actually want to plant it deeper than it was sitting in the pot, burying the base of the stem a good 2 to 3 inches below the surrounding soil surface, so the top of the root ball ends up sitting well underneath the soil line. That probably sounds wrong. It goes against everything you've learned. But there are 2 very good reasons behind it, and once you understand them, you'll never plant a clematis shallow again. The first reason is protection against clematis wilt. This is the horror movie scenario where a completely healthy-looking vine suddenly wilts and collapses almost overnight, usually caused by a fungal infection attacking the base of the stem. It's devastating to watch, and it's the #1 reason people give up on clematis entirely, convinced the plant is simply too fragile to bother with. But here's the thing. When you plant deep, you're building in insurance. Those buried stem nodes sitting safely below the soil line are capable of pushing out brand new shoots, even if everything above ground gets wiped out by wilt. A shallow planted clematis that gets hit with wilt has absolutely nothing in reserve, and the whole plant dies. A deep planted clematis that gets hit with the exact same infection just shrugs it off, sends up fresh growth from below ground, and carries on as if nothing happened. The second reason is simply that deep planting gives you a fuller, bushier plant overall. Every single buried node along that stem is a potential new growing point. Plant deep, and you're essentially building a multi-stemmed, bushy vine right from the very start, instead of putting all your hopes on one single fragile stem trying to do all the work by itself. So if you're planting a fresh clematis right now, dig that hole deeper than feels natural, and sink the crown of the plant well below soil level. And if your clematis is already in the ground and was planted at pot level, don't panic and don't rip it out. Next time you're topping up that garden bed with fresh soil or compost, simply mound a few extra inches over the base of the existing plant. This is one of the rare gardening mistakes you can genuinely fix after the fact, and your plant will reward you for the correction. I want to repeat this one because it really is the mistake that catches out the most people, including plenty of gardeners who consider themselves experienced. It's not that the advice is hard to follow. It's that it contradicts everything you've been taught to do with literally every other plant you've ever put in the ground. Your brain sees a nursery pot, sees the soil line, and screams at you to match it exactly. With clematis, you have to consciously override that instinct every single time. Write it on a sticky note if you have to. Dig deeper than feels right. Mistake number 5, pruning without knowing your group. I saved this one for last on purpose, because it's the mistake that breaks the most hearts, and it usually happens after everything else has finally gone right. Picture this. You've done everything correctly all year long. The plant is healthy, it's covered in fresh growth. You can practically see the flower show that's about to happen. And then somebody, a neighbor, a gardening blog, a well-meaning relative, tells you that clematis needs a good hard prune. So you grab the secateurs in early spring, you cut the entire plant back hard, feeling productive and proactive, and in doing so you remove every single flower bud the plant had spent the previous year carefully saving up for you. The result is an entire summer of nothing but green leaves, all because of one well-intentioned snip. Here's what almost nobody bothers to explain clearly. There is no single correct way to prune a clematis, because clematis is divided into 3 separate pruning groups, and each one wants a completely different, sometimes opposite, treatment. Group 1 is your early bloomer. These varieties flower in spring, and critically, they flower on growth that was made the previous year. These are the ones that burst into bloom before most of your garden has even properly woken up for the season. If you cut these back hard in spring, you are physically removing the exact stems that were about to flower. The rule for Group 1 is refreshingly simple. Barely touch it. Just tidy up any dead, damaged, or overly messy growth right after it finishes flowering, and otherwise leave the plant alone for the rest of the year. Group 2 is home to the big, dramatic, dinner plate-sized blooms that show up in early summer. These varieties are a little more complicated because they flower on last year's stems for their first big flush, and then produce a second, smaller flush later in the season on new growth. These want only a light prune in early spring, just trimming back to a strong, healthy pair of buds and removing anything dead or obviously weak. Never go in hard on a Group 2 plant, or you'll sacrifice that spectacular first flush of blooms. Group 3 is the easiest group of the entire bunch, and honestly the most forgiving. These are your late summer flowering varieties, and they bloom entirely on the current year's growth. This means you can cut these back hard every single spring, almost right down to the ground, and they will race back up and reward you with a full flush of flowers by late summer. In fact, Group 3 plants actually need that hard annual cut, because without it, they turn into a bare, woody, tangled mess that only blooms in a thin strip way up at the top of the plant, out of sight and out of reach. So before you ever bring secateurs anywhere near your clematis, take the time to figure out which group your particular plant belongs to. Most plant labels will tell you directly. If you've lost the tag, or it came from a friend's garden with no information at all, just pay attention to when it naturally flowers. Early spring blooms mean leave it alone. Early summer blooms mean a light trim. Late summer blooms mean go ahead and cut it back hard. Match your pruning approach to the correct group, and your clematis will reward you with a bigger, better flower display every single year without fail. Guess wrong, and you'll spend an entire growing season staring at a wall of healthy green leaves, wondering where all the flowers disappeared to. And if you genuinely can't figure out the group and there's no label anywhere to be found, here's the safest fallback. Do nothing at all for one full year. Just let the plant grow, watch when it flowers, take a mental note, and only then make your pruning decision the following spring. One skipped year of pruning has never killed a clematis. One wrong hard cut absolutely can wipe out an entire season of flowers. So when in doubt, patience beats a confident guess every single time. Bringing it all together. So let's recap exactly what separates a clematis that eventually swallows an entire wall in flowers from one that limps along for a few sad seasons and then quietly dies. You plant it deeper than instinct tells you to, so the base of the plant is protected and the whole thing grows fuller right from below the soil line. You keep the roots shaded and cool while still letting the top half of the plant soak up plenty of direct sun. You avoid the hidden rain shadow along walls and fences, planting further out and leaning the stem back toward its support instead. You give those delicate leaf tendrils something genuinely thin enough to grip onto, long before the plant actually needs it. And finally, you take the time to learn your pruning group before the secateurs ever come anywhere near the plant. None of these 5 fixes are difficult. None of them cost much money or much time. They're simply the handful of details that run directly against your natural gardening instincts, which is exactly why so many people get them wrong in the first place and end up convinced that clematis is a fussy, difficult, temperamental plant. It isn't. It never was. It just plays by its own set of rules, and now that you know what those rules actually are, there's really nothing